The room didn't erupt when my mother-in-law said it. It went completely still. "She's not a real doctor," she announced, voice cutting through the hospital boardroom like a scalpel. "She married my son for his money and faked everything else. Every credential, every surgery she claims to have done, it's all a lie." I didn't flinch. I didn't look at her. I looked straight at the board chairman seated at the head of the long mahogany table. For a stretched second, nothing moved. Then the chairman leaned forward slowly, deliberately, his fingers pressing against a manila folder I hadn't noticed before. The sound of paper shifting filled the silence. That's when I understood the truth was finally about to speak for itself. I learned a long time ago that grief makes people search for someone to blame. It twists love into suspicion, turns memory into accusation. That boardroom silence felt exactly like that, heavy with expectation, thick with something waiting to be revealed. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from confusion but from a storm gathering strength. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been standing in my kitchen, still wearing scrubs stained from a 12-hour shift, when the letter arrived. Thick paper, hospital letterhead. My married name printed in bold letters that looked more like a verdict than an address. I recognized the format of a formal complaint before I even opened the envelope. Allegations of credential fraud. Complaint filed by Judith Holloway. Subject: Dr. Claire Brennan. My mother-in-law, suing me through the hospital board. Not for money, not for property, for my identity. I laughed once, quietly. Not because it was funny, but because my body didn't know what else to do with the shock. My coffee sat untouched on the counter, steam long gone. Outside, the December wind rattled the windows of the small house Daniel and I had bought together 3 years ago. The house that still smelled faintly of his cologne in the closet I couldn't bring myself to empty. Credential fraud. As if everything I'd worked for could be erased by a grieving woman's anger. I folded the paper carefully and set it on the table next to the framed photo from our wedding day. Daniel's smile frozen in time, his arm around my waist, both of us unaware of how little time we had left. It had been 8 months since the accident. 8 months since a drunk driver ran a red light and took my husband while I was in the middle of a surgery I couldn't leave. 8 months since I'd looked up from a patient's open chest cavity to find the charge nurse standing in the doorway with tears streaming down her face. I saved my patient that night. I couldn't save Daniel. His mother never forgave me for that. She never said it outright. But I felt it in every conversation that grew shorter, every holiday invitation that stopped coming, every glance that accused me of surviving when her son didn't. The night I got the complaint, I pulled out the box of documents I kept in the closet. Medical school transcripts, board certification letters, residency completion records, photos from graduation, from my first surgery, from the day I was named chief resident at 29 years old. I didn't open everything. I didn't need to. Truth doesn't require rehearsal. The next morning, I called the hospital's legal liaison. Her voice was careful, measured. "Yes, Dr. Brennan," she said. "Mrs. Holloway is alleging that you obtained your position through fraudulent credentials and that you married her son under false pretenses." "What pretenses?" I asked. There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. "The filing doesn't specify evidence, only allegations." Of course it didn't. Judith never needed evidence. She only needed an audience. I drove past her house that afternoon without stopping. The colonial she and Richard had lived in for 40 years looked smaller than I remembered. The garden Daniel used to help maintain now overgrown and neglected. The Christmas wreath on the door hung crooked, faded from weeks of New England weather. That wreath had been Daniel's tradition. He'd hung one every year since he was a boy. His mother kept it up even now, even though she could barely look at anything else that reminded her of him. I understood her pain. I just couldn't let it destroy everything I'd built. The night before the hearing, I pressed my clothes and laid everything out with care, not ceremony, just respect. I chose the blazer Daniel had bought me for my 30th birthday, the one he said made me look like I could take on the world. My hands trembled slightly as I buttoned it in the morning, but my reflection in the mirror looked steady enough. The hospital administrative building sat across from the main campus, a brick structure that always felt more like a courthouse than a medical facility. I arrived early. Always early. A habit from residency, when being late could mean losing a patient. Inside, the air smelled like floor cleaner and old files. The security guard nodded when he saw my badge, eyes flicking briefly to my face before returning to his monitor. He knew who I was. Everyone in this hospital knew who I was now. Judith was already there. She stood when she saw me, jaw tight, shoulders squared like she was preparing for battle. She looked older than she had at Daniel's funeral, not weaker, just worn. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying anger for too long. Richard sat beside her, hands folded in his lap, staring at the floor as if the carpet pattern held some answer he desperately needed. Daniel's father had always been the quiet one, the peacemaker who smoothed over his wife's sharp edges. He didn't look at me now. Neither of them spoke. When the board members entered, they filed in with the heavy footsteps of people who'd rather be anywhere else. 5 of them in total, led by Chairman Morrison, a man I'd spoken to exactly twice in my 3 years at this hospital. His eyes moved over the room once, then paused on me. There was no expression there, just attention. The hearing was called to order. My name sounded different in that space, heavier, like it carried the weight of everything I'd ever done and everything I was accused of faking. Judith didn't wait for the proceedings to formally begin. She leaned forward, voice sharp with 18 months of stored resentment. "She's not who she says she is," she said. "My son was deceived. This hospital has been deceived. Every patient she's touched has been deceived." I felt the words hit the air and hang there, waiting for a reaction. I didn't give one. I looked at Chairman Morrison. That's when he opened the manila folder. And that's where the story truly begins. The chairman didn't speak right away after Judith's accusation. He remained seated, hands resting on the open folder, eyes moving from her to me and back again. Then, without comment, he adjusted his reading glasses. "Mrs. Holloway," he said calmly, "you'll have the opportunity to present your concerns. For now, let's proceed with proper order." Judith didn't like that. I could see it in the way her fingers curled against the armrest of her chair, the way her jaw tightened. Control had always been her language, and having it redirected felt like an insult. The hospital's legal representative rose, a woman about my age with careful eyes and a voice trained to sound neutral even when the facts were damaging. She spoke about the complaint, about the allegations, about how the board was obligated to investigate any claims of credential fraud regardless of the source. As she spoke, my mind drifted backward to the first time Judith accused me of being something I wasn't. It was 2 weeks after Daniel proposed. We'd driven to Connecticut for Sunday dinner, the ring still new enough on my finger that I kept catching myself staring at it. Judith had pulled me aside in the kitchen while Daniel helped his father with something in the garage. "You know he comes from money," she said, not looking at me. "Old money. The kind that attracts certain types of people." "What types?" I asked, genuinely confused. She finally met my eyes. "The kind who pretend to be more than they are." I didn't defend myself that night. I thought she'd come around once she knew me better. I thought love would be enough to prove my intentions. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. The legal representative finished. The chairman nodded once and turned to me. "Dr. Brennan," he said, "you may respond." I stood. My knees protested the hours I'd spent on my feet in surgery the day before, a familiar ache that reminded me where I'd been and what I'd given to be here. I didn't rush. There's a rhythm to standing your ground, and it doesn't like to be hurried. "Yes, Mr. Chairman," I said. "I've brought documentation." I placed my folder on the table. No flourish, no speech, just paper. Thick, unremarkable, undeniable. Judith scoffed softly from across the room. "Documents can be forged, bought." The chairman raised a hand without looking at her. "You'll have your opportunity, Mrs. Holloway." His eyes moved back to me. "Please continue, Dr. Brennan." I opened the folder and slid out the first page. My medical school diploma, the original, complete with raised seal and signatures. I didn't explain it. I didn't need to. The document explained itself. The boardroom was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, less hostile, more focused. As the chairman reviewed the papers, I thought about Daniel, how he'd been the first person outside of my study group to see my board scores, how he'd picked me up and spun me around in his apartment, knocking over a lamp neither of us cared about, How he'd told me that night that he'd never met anyone who worked as hard as I did for something they believed in. He never questioned who I was. He never needed to. "Mrs. Holloway," the chairman said, looking up, "were you aware of your daughter-in-law's educational background before filing this complaint?" Judith opened her mouth, then closed it again. She never talked about it, never showed us anything. I met her eyes for the first time that day. "You never asked." The words came out steady, but they landed harder than I expected. Richard flinched, just slightly. It was the first movement I'd seen from him since we sat down. The chairman set the diploma aside and pulled out the next document. Board certification, then residency completion. Then letters of recommendation from 3 department heads at my previous hospital. This board, he corrected himself, will review all submitted materials thoroughly. Mrs. Holloway, I'd advise you to remember that allegations of fraud are serious matters with serious consequences for the accused and the accuser. Fraud. The word echoed in my head. I'd seen fraud before. I'd seen colleagues who cut corners, who let their egos override patient safety, who claimed credit for work they hadn't done. I'd also seen dedication in places people never acknowledged. In the nurses who stayed past their shifts, in the residents who slept in call rooms for days, in the quiet heroism of showing up when no one was watching. Judith leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, as if daring the room to challenge her. I realized then that this hearing wasn't about truth to her. It was about control, about reclaiming something she felt she'd lost when her son chose me, when her son died and I kept living. The chairman announced a brief recess. In the hallway, people moved carefully around us, glancing and then looking away. A nurse I'd worked with in the ER nodded at me as she passed, her expression caught between sympathy and uncertainty. Judith stood a few feet away, speaking in low, urgent tones to Richard. He shook his head once, twice, but didn't argue. He never did. I walked to the window at the end of the hall and looked out at the parking lot below. Somewhere down there, patients were arriving, families were waiting, lives were changing in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The hospital didn't stop for personal drama. It never did. When we reconvened, the chairman returned with the same measured composure, but something about his posture had shifted. He carried himself the way people do when they've made a decision and accepted whatever consequences come with it. "Before we continue," he said, taking his seat, "I need to disclose something to this board." A murmur rippled through the room. Judith sat up straighter, sensing an advantage she didn't yet understand. The chairman removed his glasses and set them on the table. For a moment, he looked less like an administrator and more like a grandfather, tired and weighted with something personal. 18 months ago, he began, my grandson was brought into the emergency department of this hospital. He was 7 years old. He'd been in a car accident on Route 9, same road, same kind of senseless tragedy that seems to find the people who deserve it least. I felt my breath catch. I remembered that night, the small body on the gurney, the internal bleeding that wouldn't stop, the parents in the waiting room, holding each other like they might collapse if they let go. He had a ruptured spleen and a collapsed lung, the chairman continued. The attending physician that night told me later that most surgeons would have called it, would have given up after the second complication. He looked directly at me now, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Recognition. But the surgeon who worked on my grandson didn't give up. She stayed in that operating room for 6 hours. She refused to let him go. The room had gone completely silent. My grandson's name is Oliver, the chairman said. He turned 9 last month. He wants to be an astronaut. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. He's alive because of Dr. Brennan. Judith's face had gone pale. Richard's head was bowed, his shoulders shaking with something that might have been tears. I didn't know this until I reviewed the surgical records this morning, the chairman said. Dr. Brennan never told me, never mentioned it once in any of our interactions, because that's not who she is. He picked up another document from his folder. A printout I hadn't seen before. I also pulled her surgical statistics for the past 3 years, he continued. 94% success rate in trauma cases, 12 commendations from colleagues, 0 malpractice claims, 0 disciplinary actions. He set the paper down and looked at Judith. Mrs. Holloway, I understand grief. I understand the need to find someone to blame when the world takes something precious from you. But this board will not be used as a weapon against a physician whose only crime was surviving a tragedy she couldn't prevent. Judith opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. This complaint is dismissed, the chairman said, permanently. And I'd strongly encourage you to consider the damage that false accusations can do, not just to the accused, but to everyone who has to carry the weight of them. The room remained frozen for a long moment. Then Richard stood, slowly, painfully. He walked around the table until he was standing in front of me. "Claire," he said, voice rough. "I didn't know. About the surgeries. About any of it." I nodded. "I know. Daniel talked about you constantly," he continued. "How proud he was. How you never stopped fighting for your patients." He paused, struggling with something. I should have listened to him instead of her. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, metallic. Daniel's watch. The one his grandfather had given him. The one he'd worn every day of our marriage. "Judith wanted to keep it," Richard said. "But it doesn't belong to her. It belongs to you." I took the watch with hands that trembled despite my best efforts. The weight of it was familiar, achingly so. "Thank you," I managed. Behind him, Judith sat motionless, staring at the table as if she'd never seen it before. Her armor had cracked, and I could see the broken woman underneath, the mother who'd lost her only son and didn't know how to live in a world without him. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt tired, the kind of tired that settles into your bones after a battle you never wanted to fight. Outside, the December air bit at my cheeks. The sun had come out, thin and pale, turning the snow to slush on the sidewalks. I stood on the hospital steps for a moment, breathing, letting the cold anchor me to something real. A hand touched my elbow. I turned to find Chairman Morrison standing beside me, his coat pulled tight against the wind. "I owe you more than a dismissal," he said quietly. "Oliver, he asks about you sometimes. The doctor with the kind voice, he calls you." I felt something loosen in my chest. "I'm glad he's doing well. He's more than well. He's thriving." Morrison paused. "I meant what I said in there, about who you are. The hospital sees the statistics. I saw what you did for my family." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "If you ever need anything," he said, "and I mean anything, my door is open." I watched him walk back inside, disappearing through the automatic doors like any other administrator heading back to work. The drive home took longer than usual. I didn't rush. I needed the time to let everything settle, to find room for all the emotions that had been compressed into that small boardroom. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for several minutes, Daniel's watch in my hand. I traced the scratches on the face, the worn leather of the band. He'd been wearing it the night he proposed, the night we got married, the night he died. Some objects carry more than memories. They carry pieces of the people who wore them. I went inside and placed the watch on the nightstand, next to the photo from our wedding. Then I sat on the edge of the bed we'd shared and let myself cry for the first time in months. Not from sadness, from release. The weeks that followed moved slowly, like a river finding its way around new obstacles. The hearing became hospital gossip for a few days, then faded into the background noise of a place where bigger dramas happened every shift. I went back to work. Surgeries, consultations, the endless rhythm of saving lives and losing them. The work didn't change just because my personal life had been turned inside out and examined under fluorescent lights. But something else did change. 3 days after the hearing, a letter arrived at my office. No return address, just my name in handwriting I didn't recognize. I opened it carefully. "Dr. Brennan," it began. "I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not sure I deserve it. But I want you to know that I spent last night reading Daniel's journals, the ones he kept all through your relationship. He wrote about you constantly, about how you never stopped believing in people, even when they gave you reasons not to. About how you taught him that love wasn't about control but about trust." The letter went on for 2 pages. Judith's words were halting, awkward, clearly written by someone unused to apologizing. "I blamed you because it was easier than blaming God or fate or the drunk driver who walked away without a scratch. I blamed you because you were there and he wasn't, and I couldn't accept that sometimes terrible things happen to people who don't deserve them. She wrote about Daniel as a child, about the dreams she'd had for him, about the future she'd imagined that would never come true. Richard showed me the surgical records, she continued. Not just for the chairman's grandson, for dozens of others, children, parents, people who got to go home because you refused to give up. The final paragraph was shorter. I'm not asking to be part of your life. I understand if you never want to see me again, but I wanted you to know that I see you now. The real you. The one my son loved. I'm sorry it took losing him for me to look. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with Daniel's other things. I didn't call her. Not that day. Not the next week. Some wounds need time before they can be touched. But on Christmas Eve, I found myself driving the familiar route to Connecticut. The Colonial looked different in the snow, softer somehow. The crooked wreath finally straightened on the door. Richard answered my knock. His eyes widened, then softened. "Claire," he said. "We didn't expect." "I know." I held out the small package I'd brought. A frame containing a photo from Daniel's phone, one I'd found while going through his cloud storage. Daniel and his mother at his medical school graduation, before he decided to switch careers and become an architect. Before he met me. "I thought she might want this," I said. Richard took the frame with trembling hands. Behind him, I could see Judith standing in the hallway, frozen, uncertain. I didn't stay long. We didn't hug or make promises about the future. We just stood in the doorway of a house that used to feel like enemy territory, and acknowledged that we were all still standing. That was enough. The drive home felt shorter this time. The snow had started falling again, soft and steady, covering the road in white. When I got back, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and Daniel's watch on my wrist. The stars were hidden behind clouds, but I knew they were there. Some stories end with vindication. This one didn't. It ended with space, room to breathe, to grieve, to decide what comes next without a boardroom or an audience. I thought about Daniel, about the life we'd built and the future we'd never get to have, about the patients still waiting, still needing someone to fight for them when they couldn't fight for themselves. I thought about Judith, learning slowly that letting go doesn't mean betraying the person you lost. Sometimes it means finally seeing what they saw all along. And I thought about the accusation that started it all. She's not a real doctor. She faked everything. The truth had answered without shouting. It always does. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever been accused of being something you're not, or forced to prove your worth to people who should have believed in you from the start, I want you to know this. You don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to destroy yourself proving you exist. Live your truth. Let time do the talking. I'd love to hear what this story meant to you. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. We share stories like this every day. Stories about dignity, family, and the kind of justice that doesn't make noise but lasts. If you don't want to miss the next one, tap subscribe and stay with us. Let's keep walking this road together.